glad to welcome David Pyrooz. He is an associate professor of sociology and a faculty associate of prevention science at the Institute of Behavioral Science at the University of Colorado Boulder. He received his PhD in criminology and criminal justice from Arizona State University. He has also been a graduate research fellow at the National Institute of Justice. He's been a Young Scholar Award winner from a couple of organizations, including the American Society of Criminology. And he is an expert on gangs and criminal networks, and I've asked him to come talk about that topic, the latest research on gangs, what we know about them, what we think we know about them, and what the reality is. So David, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thank you, Chris. Thank you for having me. And I want to start by just saying, I teach a lot, I've taught courses on gangs for 15 years now at the university level at places like Fresno State and Arizona State, Sam Houston State University and the University of Colorado Boulder. And whenever I start my class on this, the first question I ask the students to answer is, tell me what's the first thing that jumps out to you when I say the word gang. And I'm not going to ask you all to do this, but usually what they say is violence, drugs, guns, something about neighborhoods. Then you start getting into the more really stereotypical activities, the stereotypes on gangs having to do with race, ethnicity, immigration, characteristics of neighborhoods, and so on. Those stereotypes have developed over the years. And I want to start by just saying it wasn't always that way. So what I want to do in this presentation is to start by sharing this cover of Life magazine from 1957. And it harkens back to a simpler time when we think about gangs. And I look at this picture, and I get a little bit jealous about all that hair on those guys' heads. But they're kind of stylish, nice jackets, hats, but they also look a little intimidating too. And the guns, the drugs, the homicides, the violence, it didn't exist, or if it did exist, it wasn't nearly as intense or as consequential as it is today. At least that's what we think during these sort of post-World War II boom times. 1957 was significant for a different reason, which is that it marked what is possibly the earliest turning point in how we thought about gangs. And the reason why, and what prompted this Life magazine cover right here, was the homicide of Michael Farmer in the Upper West Side of New York City. There were 11 murders that year of youth in New York City at that time. This was in Washington Heights. And 50 years later, in 2007, NPR, they did this great story commemorating this shift. Lou Yablonsky, who was doing research in New York City at the time, was part of it. Several other people, including Michael Farmer's brother, came and spoke. They also had one of the members or former members of the gang that was responsible for that killing. And if it wasn't for, what they also did in that clip was they reminded people that if it wasn't for that murder of Michael Farmer, the Broadway musical and 10-time Academy Award-winning film West Side Story would have been called East Side Story. And it would have been between Catholics and Jews, not between whites and Puerto Ricans. So with that in mind, we should start with recognizing the release of West Side Story coming up on December 10th. Because few movies have done as much to serve as both an anchor and a genesis for our popular perceptions about gangs. Now, you could set aside the dancing and the singing, but Spielberg's remake is certain to remind us of those early images about gangs, providing a stark contrast to the gangland of today. So the purpose of this presentation is twofold. So one thing that I want to do is to explain how we got to where we are today, and to highlight the big macro level changes. And the second thing I want to do is to detail how those macro level changes in policy, social, and economic political landscape got us to where we are today. So that portion of the presentation will focus primarily on dispelling myths about gangs and to highlight the leading research on this topic. Let me go back for just a second here. I'm drawing primarily from a book that we have coming out. That's the only image that I could get of it. I'm not trying to hawk book sales or anything like that. These academic books are a little bit different than what's written for popular press. Nonetheless, my background, I'm from California, the Central Valley of California, sort of spent time between the Bay Area and around the Modesto, Merced area. So I grew up with two very stark, different contrasts of gangs. One in San Jose on the west side of the city, and the other one in the Central Valley of a primarily immigrant community. So those are some of the things that really really spurred my interest in these topics, which I've been conducting research on this topic for the last 15 years, including some work in Texas in prisons, as well as conducting some evaluations of gang intervention programs in Denver. So I should absolutely recognize my colleagues, Scott Decker and James Densley, at this point of the presentation. So, structure. What are we talking about here? And this is really the economic, the physical, the political, and the social forces that lock things into place, as sociologists like to study. And when we're talking about structure, the way that this matters is because it sets up our relationships, the distribution of resources, our positions, and our roles. So something like mass incarceration. You could imagine when there's large concentrations of fatherless households because people have been sentenced to prison for prolonged periods of time. How do you exercise control in communities when those fathers are absent? School catchment areas is another example. You can think of if you enter in this one portion of the community, it's going to result in a very different environment in that school than if you exclude, say, these housing projects, this trailer park, this affluent area of suburban homes. I know it's hard to talk about structure, and sometimes it's really difficult to get structure into our news articles. A lot of times it's much easier to be able to communicate, about someone's personal experiences, not about the policies that sets up or creates these personal experiences. So let's go into a little bit of detail about structure here. And the first thing we should highlight is the way people thought about gangs in the past, 100 years ago, is very different than how we think about them today. They were playgroups. They were a normal part of the childhood experience. Puffer, where this quote is from, he says, the gang while it lasts is for the boy of one of three primary groups. And the way he's describing them is it's a normal experience. The G word was devoid of stigma. The G word wasn't the boogeyman that it is today. And so at best, they could be thought of as troublesome youth groups. Not too different from the West Side Story, Officer Krupke, Lieutenant Schrank, and so on. They knew that the groups were problematic, but they just didn't think about them. They didn't respond to them in the same way that we do today. Frederick Thrasher, his classic map of Chicago's gangland from the 1920s, the way he describes these 1,313 groups in Chicago, he says they're interstitial in its definition. They are in the physical and social locations of cities. They are sort of betwixt and between adulthood and adolescence. They're spontaneous in the sense that these are unplanned associations. This is not coordinated activities, coordinated recruitment. They just sort of come together haphazardly. And conflict. This is about their emergent group process. How does the group gel together? It gels together through conflict. These are things that bring out like the collective consciousness of the group. So, yes, there was conflict, but the way Thrasher thought about gangs then was it was a reflection of the failure of our institutions, the failure of the family, the failure of the schools, and the failure of the community. And as a result of that, the gang was an attempt to bring a semblance of order in a place where order didn't exist. So that's changed a bit. In the decade after the release of West Side Story, the meaning of the gang started to change. On the academic side of the conversation, at least among researchers like myself, that change was realized with Malcolm Klein's definition. So again, I just said talked about Thrasher and Puffer. Here's Klein's definition. And this was a turning point because it added crime to the definition. You can't be a gang unless you commit crime, and that crime on behalf of the group, and that crime contributes to the collective identity of the group. Now, on the legal side, that turning point really didn't become concrete until California passed the Street Terrorism Enforcement and Prevention Act in 1988. But across police departments, at least in our urban areas, there were street gang units forming in the 1970s, or really, I think it was in '66 in Chicago. It might have been after that. But Los Angeles formed their gang unit. You saw this in cities across the United States. To be able to respond to gangs, you got to have a definition of them. And here's how California defined a gang, and this spread across the United States. This was a turning point at that time because all of a sudden this became a legal issue with gangs. So they were no longer described as these more innocent associations that occasionally engage in deviance. Now they're described as criminal associations, not unlike the way we would think of organized crime. And that sounds a lot different, or that sounds, at least those definitions from the early 1900s sound a lot different than the way we think about gangs today. So what explains this? How did we get there? How did we get to the point where we are in 2021? Well, there were some major socio-political shifts. So one has to do with economic reshuffling and deindustrialization. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, but some people have pinned not only the institutionalization of these groups, but also the regeneration of them constantly over and over in these neighborhoods because of deindustrialization. Those good jobs, those stable jobs that paid well, had essentially vanished. In other words, they were offshored or they were devalued, and with those changes, it blocked the off-ramps out of gangs. So that transition in those late teenage years into adulthood, to jobs, to relationships, and so on, those things vanished. And gang membership was prolonged into emerging adulthood, and gangs were thought of as this quintessential American enterprise. It was able to provide for the young people in a way that our communities and our neighborhoods couldn't. Another major shift has to do with population movement. This is partly a carryover from Wilson's argument with deindustrialization, particularly for Black Americans, was the rise of hypersegregation and concentrated disadvantages in our communities. And it created what we could think of as a spatial mismatch and a skills mismatch. So the jobs were far away, or the people were far away from the good jobs for which they were qualified, and close to the jobs for which they were unqualified. But this also had to do with immigration composition. Essentially in our urban areas, like the white urban gang vanished. The immigrants essentially became white instead of being ethnic Europeans. And as a result, and then there was suburbanization, and they migrated to the ever-expanding suburbs, and mass migration was primarily from Latin American and from Asian countries, as you could see on this chart, the shift just from the 1960s through the 2010s. Now, there was, we think of with migration, the classic model is what's called straight line assimilation. You immigrate to the United States. By second generation, you start to assimilate into the dominant culture, and by third generation, you're essentially American. Well, it wasn't really working that way towards the latter half of the 20th century, especially in terms of gangs. And as you can see on this chart here, that's Thrasher's roster of the ethnic composition of gangs in Chicago. Mixed nationality was the dominant set of gangs. Polish gangs were afterwards, Italian gangs. I highlight Black and American white gangs. But notice, for one, they're not called white, and they're referred to in terms of their nation of origin. Now, according to police data, this is from 2010, There's some limitations here, which I'll go into in a bit, but it's broken out by whether they're black, white, Latino, or other. And you can see the demographic composition of gangs in the United States has changed rather remarkably. So that's the second one. Huh?
Would the mixed nationality mean like Polish and Italian?
Yep.
That kind of thing?
Yeah. There were some black-white gangs, black and white gangs, but again, that was very rare in Chicago at that time. Very homogenous groups. And it had to do primarily with like turnover in neighborhoods as the neighborhood shifted from being, say, Italian to Puerto Rican. There was a little bit of integration, but eventually it changed altogether. I'm going to return to this too when I get to the contextual focus. Okay, so and then we know the change in the rise of the punitive state in the United States. So this had to do with the political wind shifting, the rise of conservatism, the rise of neoliberalism, and Democrats and Republicans alike supported the expansion of the criminal justice system. So the rehabilitative ideal that had dominated for a couple of decades essentially changed, and it took a backseat to the Get Tough movement. And the Get Tough movement has played out in a number of different ways. Perhaps most emblematic of this was the Gun-Free Schools Act in 1994, the crime bill in 1994. They at least set in motion, or didn't set it in motion, but they incentivized some of our Get Tough policies in this country. Oh, give me 1 second here. And then mass incarceration, we went under an imprisonment binge. And our rates of imprisonment jumped from the 1970s to about 100 per 100,000 to 300 per 100,000 in the matter of 2 decades. So that was a pretty quick change. And then it comes to gangs. And legislation has been in effect in 46 states. It all started in California in 1998 with the passage of the STEP Act, as it's referred to. But all 46 states define a gang. You sort of have to if you're going to develop responses to it. But from there, as you can see, 40 or 45 other states after California passed it, and then you could see what they define in their statutes. So we just went through it and coded up all these statutes, identified the key themes. So out of those 46 states and the federal government with legislation, another 18 of them have a definition of a gang member. So for those other 28 states or jurisdictions, it's up to local law enforcement to make that determination, and prosecutors and so on. 12 states have laws related to databases, shared gang databases in place. Our sentencing enhancements. So for example, our sentencing enhancements, if you commit a violent felony in California and it has a gang nexus to it, you can get an additional 10 years tacked on to your criminal sentence. Not unlike what you could see with like hate crime statutes and so on. So some states criminalize recruitment, some states criminalize even misdemeanors with a gang nexus. And so, critics contend, and perhaps rightly so, that this is colorblind racism, or systemic racism in the sense that overwhelmingly, our gang databases are occupied, by people who are, almost exclusively black and Latino. And as a consequence, you see these sentencing enhancements applied to those same people. So in a state like California, The Guardian reported that 6% of prisoners in CDCR have a gang enhancement attached to them. That's just really large numbers, as you might expect. So the third major shift has to do with guns. The fourth major shift, the rise of guns to settle disputes. So we know gun ownership has declined in our country, but gun manufacturing has skyrocketed. The vast majority of crime guns that are used by gangs, they're not obtained legally. It's either obtained through straw purchasers. They're stolen in vehicle thefts, stolen in home evasions, or in burglaries. And accordingly, the vast majority of gang homicides involve the use of weapons. It's like over 90% of gang homicides. Versus about 70% of non-gang homicides. This is from the Supplemental Homicide Report. The one thing I really wanted to highlight here was in the early 1980s, just focusing on the population that's around the gang-involved age population, 12 to 24, it wasn't that different in the proportion of homicides that involved a firearm. You go to 2019, and it's an upwards of 90% of youthful homicides involve the use of a firearm. And this is very common when it comes to gang-related homicides. And the last thing to point out here, and this is what we probably understand the least of, has to do with the rise of the use of the internet and social media. This is such a big change. It's affected everyone in just about every part of our, in just every part of our lives. But 15 years ago, my colleague Andy Papachristos, he has this great quote, and I give him a hard time for this, is, "Few gang members ever discuss or mention the internet. Many don't possess the hardware, software, or technical skills to manage the web." I mean, how times have changed in the matter of 17 years. So just like West Side Story was sort of the anchor to gangs of the 1960s, American Me, Menace to Society, Colors, those types of movies at the end of the 1980s, early 1990s, really were the anchor of gangs at that time. The internet serves that purpose now. And popular media, driven in part by music and movies, but also gossip, threats, intimidation, these videos that are posted on YouTube, live recordings on Twitter, Snapchat, and so on, those have become a place where gangs are active in a way that they weren't before in the past. Now, most gangs are homegrown. So like if you see something like MS-13 in like Italy or in Spain, that's usually not associated with the MS-13 activities that originated in Los Angeles, much less in El Salvador. And gangs don't really franchise and migrate to other areas, but they do take on the imagery. They do take on the symbols as a defense mechanism is how it's proposed. It's called big gang theory. And they want to be the biggest and the baddest as a way to defend themselves, just not unlike how you see gangs take on words or names like ISIS or Taliban in the United States is not uncommon. This is how you could explain the cultural diffusion. It used to be through music and movies, but now the internet is serving that purpose, and why you see groups like 18th Street originate or emerge in Spain, or you see the Crips in Belgium, and so on. Now, the internet and social media is not just an anchor, it's also a genesis. Not unlike how West Side Story served that purpose for gang imagery from the 1960s. Now, the internet and social media can also be a facilitator of violence. Now, there's some disagreement among researchers among this because the evidence is still wanting, but ultimately the internet can make permanent those taunts and those threats that are issued online. Because as Jeff Lane at Rutgers calls it, this is the digital street. It's something, there's information that's shared, there's interactions among people that can exacerbate conflict. So the classic examples of this come from Chicago. Kakira Barnes, who was featured in A&E's The Secret Life of a Gang Girl, she posted her location and she was killed shortly after, and there was a lot of violence that was associated with some of her activities, as well as this, the Chief Keef Lil Jojo exchange, where taunting lyrics corresponded ultimately with social media exchanges and Lil Jojo's death. So, word traveled fast before, but the way that word traveled fast was through phone conversations, through hanging out on the stoop or the corner and talking to people. It's much more public now, and it can be acted upon now in a way that we couldn't before. So with these structural changes in mind, I want to focus or sort of give you this, this 30,000 foot view of a place like Chicago or of the United States as a whole on things like criminal justice legislation. Let's get down into some of the more details about what the research has showed over the last 30 years, because there has been an explosion of research on this topic by criminologists, but also by sociologists, psychologists, and economists, and so on. And so, for those of you who have seen American Me, and I know this gets more difficult to talk to my students about every year because they don't watch these movies anymore, but this is a young Montoya, JD, and Mundo from the American, it's a classic movie that maintained a great deal of street level controversy. And so when we're talking about the context, we're talking about situations, interactions among people in places. And one of the myths, and you hear this on both sides of sort of the political, ideological aisle. On the one hand, you hear people remark that, all kids in communities are gang members. There was this op-ed in the New York Times a couple of years ago that said, to the Chicago Police Department, any black kid is in a gang. On the other side, you'll hear people say, well, there's nothing, these gangs don't exist altogether. There is nothing of the sort. They're radical, they're resistance movements. They're kids who are just trying to make the best out of a bad situation. And as Joan Moore used to say, neither of those representations are accurate. So what is the prevalence? How many kids are involved in groups like this? So you have the research side, which uses the methodology that asks kids and interviews them to say, are you a member of a gang? Are your friends a gang, considered a gang? Or they use like these 5 indicators from Eurogang because they didn't want to use the G word in Europe because it just had a different meaning than it does in the United States. And so here's the prevalence from national studies. A study sponsored by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, 8% of kids by their early 20s self-nominate as a gang member. The Ad Health, from a health-based survey, about 5%. Regional studies, the Gang Resistance Education Training Study, this is in 7 cities, about 13% of people self-nominate by their high school years. Rochester, New York, that's the highest estimate, 30%. So it gives you a sense that, about this myth is, are all of them, none of them in a gang? And they're sort of extreme positions, but ultimately it is a non-trivial minority of kids who are involved in gangs. On the law enforcement side, these are their typical indicators. They look at photos, they look at communication, they look at graffiti. They also use self-nomination. The difference on the law enforcement side is they typically need about 2 of these things two of these things need to be met before they would be considered a gang. Law enforcement estimates are a lot lower. According to the police, it's about 0.3%, or if we look at like the gang active ages, about a little less than 1%. This is what you would expect. It's harder to get into a police gang database than it is for someone to self-nominate as a gang member. In prisons, those numbers are much higher. Surveys of correctional officials, it's about 15% of prisoners. And this is due to a combination of importation. They bring their street gang affiliations into prison, or their gang affiliations originate in prison.
David, if I could ask a quick clarifying question. On the police numbers, that's police estimates of the number of kids who are in a gang, or is that the number of kids who are actually in their databases? So
they're police estimates. So you get a large jurisdiction like an LAPD, they're going to have the demographic breakdown. And in fact, CalGang data was all public. I mean, LAPD pulled out of it, but you can go on and all that data is public, and you can see according by law enforcement agency. So for some of them, they're just pulling up data from their database. For others, what they're doing is just giving a best guess. Okay, that's the most recent data, 2012. That was the last time the National Youth Gang Survey was administered to law enforcement agencies. The National Institute of Justice in 2020 had an RFP, and RAND was funded with reinitiating this survey. So I suspect we are going to get some newer estimates within the next year or two, according to law enforcement. The next myth to cover is the lifetime of commitment associated with gang membership. And so West Side Story, you see Riff in here, that's when he initiates that song. If you're a jet all the way from your first cigarette to your last dying day. Well, in Riff's case, that was his last dying day. But for others, a lot of people believe that if you join a gang, you can never leave. And, it's the modern equivalent of that is from Blood In, Blood Out, which they had their name changed to that movie to Bound by Honor. It's another sort of classic origin story of the Mexican Mafia. Came out within a year of American Me. But this was a much more violent portrayal that, to join a gang, you have to spill blood, you get jumped into the group. To leave a gang, you also have to spill blood, usually a really violent exit if someone is able to exit at all. But it's not true. I mean, in some instances it's true, but overall it simply doesn't mesh with the facts. And that, nearly everyone who joins a gang also leaves one, and usually on their own accord. So that could differ by gang type, by how their tenure in the gang, their position in the gang. Those things absolutely matter, how well organized and structured it is. But we found, even when we're interviewing gang members, former gang members in Texas, in some of the most organized gangs, like the Aryan Brotherhood or the Mexican Mafia or the Texas Syndicate, people leave. And it happens with much greater frequency than we were ever believed at that time. Here's 9 different studies, okay? 9 different longitudinal studies. So they interviewed somebody at multiple points in time over their life. And there's a national study. This is the Bureau of Labor Statistics study. You have 2 different studies evaluating the gang resistance education and training program. There's one in The Hague. You see Pittsburgh, Denver, Seattle, and Rochester. All of those, they selected kids who lived in high crime communities. They're almost all telling a similar story in the sense that over time, people leave. And this duration decay, in other words. It's not a normal distribution like a bell curve. It's really stacked up in those early years. So most of these kids remain in a gang for about 1 year, another smaller proportion for 2 years, and really it's the exception if they stay for a prolonged period of time. There is a good amount of variation to that. This is from the Bureau of Labor Statistics study, the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth, and it's really an adolescence phenomenon. You could almost put these 3 curves all together, and it concentrates, their involvement concentrates in those early teen years. You have a couple who persist for a long period of time, and they're just distinguished by when they join and when they leave. And then you have about 20% of the people who ever said they were a member of a gang who indicate they joined as an adult. That's usually because of imprisonment, incarceration. Like, for example, in Texas, we found that about half of the gang members in the Texas prison system joined for the first time in their life while they were incarcerated, for protection, for safety, for camaraderie while they were behind bars. Okay, so let's go back to the race, ethnicity story, and we'll add gender and immigration to that too. But this is according to the police, and let me just highlight here. So these are police gang databases from 5 different cities, and what you have here is the percent right here who are white, the percent in the database who are black, the percent in the database who are Hispanic, and then you have the share of the city, and then a risk ratio, just basically dividing this by this. So what you could see is relative, if the denominator is the city, white people are very underrepresented in gangs in these 5 cities. Black people are highly overrepresented in gangs, in the gang database in these cities. And for Hispanic people, it's a little bit under, a little bit over, it varies. Now these are from a variety of different sources, but more generally, the point is to say is the police data tell one very different story than what the survey data are going to tell. The ethnic composition of gangs has changed a lot. If we did this 100 years ago, it would be very much European origin, youth of European origin. And that's just not the case today. So there is really no question that there is a disparity. The real question is, why is it the case today? Here's what the survey data show. This is, again, the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth. So this is representative of kids who were born between 1980 and 1984. It's a little dated now, but there hasn't been another study like this since then. Now, what you can see is there are some racial ethnic disparities in gang involvement, self-reported gang involvement. This is not the police saying it. This is a kid saying, I am a member of a gang. And about 6% of the white kids said it, 12% of black and Hispanic kids said it. So on the one hand, there is a little bit of merit, at least, behind, or a little bit of an explanation behind the disparities that are observed in police data. But what you also see is that as people get older, those disparities, self-reported, start to also increase. So in those early adolescent years or preteen years, the black to white, Hispanic to white disparities are a lot smaller than what they are in the later years. This could be some of the effects of deindustrialization. This could be some of the effects of concentrated disadvantages in communities. The prolonging of gang involvement into adulthood in the absence of other opportunities for economic advancement. But it doesn't explain the full story, to be sure. So like my colleagues Matt Vlasic and Shannon Reed say, well, the police just systematically look at white gang youth differently. You know, there's like these alt-right gangs, and they behave very similarly, but instead of getting the gang label, they get the domestic terrorist label. They get, you know, different labels of social movements or radical movements in a way that black and Latino kids simply don't get. And this could also reflect a bit of the urban-rural divide. I mean, the police surveillance is very different in rural areas and even in suburban areas than it is in our central cities. So whether it's the Chicago PD or the LAPD, they have resources that are devoted to gathering intelligence. And that's what helps reflect disparities like we see on a slide like this. Now, one of the biggest disparities that we see is in gender. And so survey and interview data, they show a fair amount of gang involvement among girls and women. So here's a couple of different studies done very differently. National study, 11-city study, a 7-city study, and this is the rosters collected among two of the most long-standing gangs in the United States, Oyo Maravilla and White Fence. So they tell somewhat of a pretty consistent story. About 30 to 40% of people self-report that they're involved, or 30% of gang members are female. You start looking at jail-based studies, arrestee studies, and those numbers start to drop. You look at the police gang databases, and this is consistent with what about 50 years ago Walter Miller said, the 10% rule. You'll never find more than 10% of a gang database or gang membership according to the police as being female. Now, not only are girls and women, they're less likely to be in gangs, but they're also less likely to be like more deeply involved at the core. They tend to be either more on the periphery, but they are involved in a great deal of gang activity, and some do operate at the core, but it tends to be more of the exception as opposed to the norm. And parenthood, jobs, and so on really start to knife off those ties. Okay. And then the last one has to do with immigration and gangs. And so we used to associate immigrants as gang involved, which may have worked initially with European immigration. It just doesn't work so well now. And so Thrasher, he identified some of these old world antagonisms that sort of spilled over from Europe to the United States. And sort of highlighted the straight line assimilation across generations, but no longer is that the case. And so here's data showing that first generation youth are the ones who are least likely to be involved in gangs. And I just want to point out the denominators here. We got some small numbers on this side, especially to reach any firm conclusions when it comes to Asian Americans. But more generally, given some of the statements that have been made, if you look at Latino kids, those numbers start at 7% for first generation. They go up to 10% for second generation. They go up to 14% for third generation. These things are important to highlight here because it really dispels, and we haven't known a lot about this topic, but it really cuts against this argument that immigrants are the ones who are disproportionately involved in gangs. So, are immigrant gang members possible? Yes, of course, and there's enough data to suggest that exists. Can there be heinous violence associated with immigrant gang members? Of course, but is it representative? I mean, not at all. So, like, to go back to the previous presidential administration, some of those call-outs of MS-13, they were involved with some pretty serious gang violence, but it was by no means representative, and by no means did it account for a large share. At best, it was probably about 2% of the gang homicides in the United States were associated with a group like MS-13. So in terms of the organization of gangs, there's this quote from Thrasher that no two gangs are just alike. And I really want to drive home this point. because there's so much variation in how gangs are, their forms, in other words, like their structural makeup, and then their functions, like what they actually do. And so most of these gangs are poorly organized. This idea of the corporate gang, it no longer even exists in Chicago so much. With some of Roberto Aspom's work, who has shown the fracturing of the big gang structures even in Chicago. And I think it's important to highlight, when we saw the ages, remember, we're talking generally about teenagers here. And for any of you who are parents in the room, you'll understand it's pretty hard to get teenagers to do stuff, to do their homework, let alone clean their room. So, this idea of corporate behavior and structure comparable to, like, say, a Starbucks or a McDonald's, it's rare to find among gangs. Instead, we should think about it as a continuum. On the one hand, we have groups that are really informal and their structure is diffuse. In other words, if you think of like a corporate structure, it's spread out horizontally. On the other end of this, they're more instrumental and able to achieve their goals. They operate more rationally like a corporation, and they have that more hierarchical structure. That distribution would be really high up here, and it would be really low over here. So here's some of the things that we look for when it comes to gang organization and structure. We're really interested in the roles and leadership. Do they have centralization and a chain of command? Most gangs don't. Their roles, are they defined? Are they differentiated? Most gangs aren't. Do they have meetings? I mean, there'll be people hanging out together, but they are not like sit-down formal meetings where you try to accomplish things, where they have minutes that are recorded and there's follow-up down the road. Is there control of things like territory? Is violence coordinated? No, it tends to be more symbolic. It tends to be more spontaneous. So most gangs are here towards the recreation stage and the criminal stage. And by that, what I mean is they're more friendship, family, or conflict origins. They tend to be organized, or their behaviors tend to be more opportunistic. And it's more about friendship and camaraderie. That's the recreation stage. You start moving into the criminal stage, and criminal activity does take a more prominent role. But again, it's still not like that organizational structure that you would find in a corporate entity. And then lastly, at the governance stage, this would be where they're monopolizing markets, they're diffusing risk, they're reinvesting profits. It's governance. And you don't see many groups doing that. So the violence associated with gangs, we have gang-related violence and gang-motivated violence. When we're talking about gang-related, this is an important distinction because a lot of times you'll see law enforcement will report that it's a gang-related homicide. What that means is that a gang member was involved in it. It could have absolutely nothing to do with furthering the interest of gangs. It could be a domestic dispute. It could be, a simple incident of disrespect between two different parties. That's a gang-related homicide. One that's motivated is to further the interest of the group. And so like in California, for example, last year or this year, they passed AB 333, and it amended the Street Terrorism Enforcement Prevention Act so that when they say like a gang enhancement, it's supposed to be gang motivated, that gang nexus. Well, it amended the act so it can't just be it benefited the gang reputationally, because it was a really low-hanging fruit, and they could prove that pretty easily. Now, what they say is they give examples and say it has to be like a financial benefit, it has to be retaliation, targeting a rival, intimidating a witness, and so on. So gang violence tends to be more public, street-based, weapons, more suspects, more victims. It's very different from non-gang violence. In the United States, the National Youth Gang Survey, about 13% of all homicides from 2012 were related to gangs. It was about 25% in large cities. In one of the studies I was involved in St. Louis, he found that gang members had homicide rates that were about 950 per 100,000, just astronomical numbers associated with gang involvement. I know I'm getting close to the end of my time here, so what I'll do, I'll finish on this slide right here, and then if we can go into some more details in the Q&A about things that work in responding to gangs. And so the last thing to highlight when it comes to gang-related violence is, it's almost tempting for people, and people have pointed to these individual characteristics of them, of gang members. Things like self-control or intelligence or psychopathy, to say, that people who are involved in gangs have these individual deficits. And that explains why they're involved in so much crime. In other words, it's about the characteristics of people. It doesn't have to do with the group. The group just reflects the people who enter into it. And it just doesn't add up. The evidence doesn't support that. It's the characteristics of the group. It's their processes. It has to do with, there's concerns about status, their cohesion, how they gel together as a group, how they're oriented normatively, towards responding to incidents of disrespect, responding to violence, to respond in retaliation. And ultimately, what we see is, there's a good deal of evidence showing on the relationship between crime and violence. And when kids are involved in gangs, their involvement in violence shoots up. And then when they leave the gang, their violence returns back to pre-gang levels. This also applies to victimization. This applies to health and other outcomes as well. There's 3 programs or practices now that we can think of as having rigorous evidence demonstrating reductions in either problem behaviors associated with gang involvement. The group violence intervention, it's come under some more critiques or criticisms lately, but this is known as focused deterrence. So it uses the stick and the carrot to respond to gangs. It's typically law enforcement led, basically communicating sanction risk to gang involved populations. And I could go into more detail on the benefits and the drawbacks of it. But it would be considered towards the top of this response pyramid. This was developed by Phelan Wyrick at the US DOJ, that it's a smaller share of the population that you're trying to target. Whereas as you move down, this is a broader share of the population. So we have what's known as functional family therapy. It's a clinical intervention. It's a clinician that works in the household to respond to problem behaviors. That's more of an intervention in this. And then you have the gang resistance education and training, school-based curriculum, law enforcement-led, with the education of children on gang-related issues was shown through a 13-lesson curriculum to reduce gang involvement by about 40% over 1 year, and I think it's 30-something% over a 4-year period. So those were some pretty interesting findings. What I'll do is I'll stop on this one because to open it up for questions, because these are some ones where the evidence isn't as established, but these are programs or practices that are somewhat well known, maybe not all of them.
Hi, I'm Joseph with the Arizona Republic. So this is going to be a really green question because I self-admittedly never have really looked at gangs before, but at our newspaper, we've kind of decided to take gangs on, but we've been wanting to do it in a bit more of a responsible way because I think the Republic's coverage of gangs in the past has been a bit problematic. So one of the things that you mentioned and we've had conversations about is kind of like the overblowing of how police refer to gangs, when they talk to us about it. So you mentioned like social media usage. And I'm actually wondering because, in Phoenix, what they're doing is like the Phoenix Police Department has been expanding its gang intervention force by really targeting social media and defending it by saying, oh, we're seeing all this activity online, thus we need millions more dollars to kind of focus on social media. And you mentioned it as well, but I just kind of wonder, as we're reporting on this and as we kind of look at the expansion of gangs, especially in like South Phoenix or West Phoenix, how prevalent is the social media equation compared to Oath Keepers, same thing, but they live pretty much online as well. Where are we seeing the use of social media and where could we kind of call bullshit on the police?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great question. It's a tricky one too. It really is, because people's behavior online isn't necessarily how they behave offline. And so there is a lot of, what you see is a lot of performative behavior that might not be authentic. And so one of the big questions is, how do you know that's who they truly are? And a lot of times what you find with law enforcement reports is they take it as a given, as a fact. In other words, they use it as a way to document someone as a gang member, to use that as a way to further charges related to criminal sentencing enhancements, and so on. So I think it's important just to start to be able to dig beneath the surface and ask questions about what is it about their behavior online that leads you to believe, for one, that they're a gang affiliate, for two, that crime is truly gang related, and for three, that there is some sort of embedded network of a rivalry between these groups. Because a lot of times the internet makes us lazy. I mean, we take it as fact that everything exists and that this is a true representation of the people, the groups, and the community, and that might not be the case. So I'm not sure what to say about whether or not it should justify, the expansion of resources. But I know a lot of law enforcement agencies are absolutely going about and monitoring the activity that's happening online. And non-government groups do this too. When it comes to street outreach workers, violent interrupters, interventionists, and so on, they're really interested in what's happening online too. So I don't know if I fully answered your question, but what we really need to do is just not assume that that's the true behavior that's taking place.
Hello, Philip Jackson of the HuffPost. I wanted to speak particularly to the first bullet point you have up there with gang crackdowns and takedowns, and then the past slide you had about gun access and numbers and things like that. So like from some time I had reported in Baltimore and Philadelphia, there's a huge conversation on ghost guns and things like that. I wanted to know if you've had any numbers or any findings about that on a national level, any trends across different cities like Philly, Baltimore, Chicago, for example, for like the use of ghost guns, the availability of it, how it's getting distributed, and how much of a concern is that really that experts are seeing?
I mean, I don't have good data on it. I haven't seen good data on the ghost guns. The data that would exist would be law enforcement reports on it. What I will say about it is, let me get the crackdown one first, because this is where the evidence is right here. This is what shows. When there's not support for it, we usually don't really hear about it. And there's opportunity costs associated. You could flood a neighborhood all you want, Operation Hammer in Los Angeles. You could do this over and over again, but it's not gonna deal with the underlying issues that continue to give rise to these gangs in the first place. So the crackdowns can bring some at least temporary peace to the communities, and that's what some of the research shows. In terms of gun access though, like some of the best research by, say, Anthony Braga, David Uroh, they went and interviewed gang members in Boston, and they went and traced like the origins of those guns. And oftentimes, this is either from straw purchasers, this is from other people who have stolen those guns. That's the origin of them. So with something like ghost guns, to the extent that it makes it easier or or less expensive, well then yeah, they could rely on them in a way that you wouldn't have to pay a premium for those high caliber weapons that gang members tend to prefer over the lower caliber ones. So this is just to say, when it comes to the ghost guns, we don't know at this point, mostly because the data haven't been gathered on it. Data at least from the individuals who are gaining access to those guns. Was there a third part to it? Did I miss that? Okay, all right.
Hi there. I'm Joel Courier from the Post-Dispatch in St. Louis. The data you showed on St. Louis gang activity was striking, but not all that surprising. One thing that I've found is that police are really reluctant to talk about gang activity. Maybe they don't want to give them legitimacy, or they don't want to promote their involvement in those gangs. As reporters, if the police don't want to talk about any of this stuff, and we know what's happening because I see the names of these gangs listed in court documents, search warrants, etc. If they're not willing to talk about what's going on the street level, what can we as reporters do to dispel some of these myths that you've mentioned here today? Like what resources, I guess, can we rely on to get the truth out?
Number one is talking to members of the community, religious leaders, business leaders. I think that the reason why the police are so reluctant, you have sort of two groups of law enforcement. One who make the gang issue central, and then another group who don't want to talk about it at all. There's no real happy medium. There's like law enforcement hasn't found a way to be able to talk about gangs so that it doesn't induce greater problems. So like in Los Angeles, when the police came out with like the 11 major gangs, I think they did it like the late 2000s, and all of a sudden the whole street is talking and saying, wait, what about my group? Why didn't I make the top 11 gangs? So, that's one of the things that you don't want law enforcement to do. But on the flip side is, I think the biggest concern is where you sort of, bury your head in the sand and pretend that this isn't a problem. Like just 2 days ago in Denver, Reverend Leon Kelly was like, just because we don't want to talk about gang violence doesn't mean it doesn't exist in our community. It does exist. So if the police don't want to talk about it, and in some ways I understand it, because they don't want to, give credence or like legitimacy to the issues which could spark a broader problem in the community. I think that there is a way to be able to speak about it by getting community voices, the young people who are experiencing it, religious leaders, community members, and so on. It doesn't have to, the number one thing doesn't have to be about violence or conflict. It could be about the good things the kids are doing. It could be about the difficulties that they're experiencing. Like during COVID, one of the biggest issues was the closure of after-school programs. The closure of the kids just couldn't hang out in a way that they could before, especially in the absence of adult supervision. So I think that there's other ways to represent the issue without, one, making law enforcement central to it, and two, without violence being central to it.
Hi, I'm Kaylee Johnson. I'm with the Fort Worth Star-Telegram. So my question is actually about the opposite end of the problem. Our police department is pretty intense about talking about gangs, and we've kind of seen them throw that something's gang-related on a lot of things without a lot of evidence. So what would your tips be for, asking the right questions to get that standard of proof of why they are saying it's gang-related, and what we can look for to try and decide if that is accurate or not?
There's two ways to go about it. One has to do with the person, the other one has to do with the incident. And so when you're focused on people, you want to go through those indicators of gang involvement. You want to say, what is it about these people that makes you believe that they're a member of a gang? So, and I don't know what it is in Fort Worth. In Texas, I think they overhauled their legislation. It was last year or something like that. And I don't think they're one of the groups that has a state-based definition of members, but what is it about the people that makes you believe that they're gang members? It's almost an uncomfortable conversation to have, but you can't just say that because they're 16 years old and they're black and from a certain community that they're a member of a gang. They've got to give you more information than that. So that's part of it, is going after questions about people. And this is going to apply on the perpetrator side, and this is going to apply on the victim side as it relates to gang-related homicides. If it's gang-motivated homicides, you should really be questioning what were those motives. And that was part of the reason why California passed that law with AB 333, was to amend the gang nexus part of it. Because it can't just be it furthers the reputation. Well, everything can further your reputation. It's pretty easy to make a legal argument about furthering a reputation, but demonstrating financial gain is a lot more difficult. Showing retaliation is a lot more difficult too. So that's another line of questioning. It's not assuming that what law enforcement says goes, just like we don't assume what other members of the community says goes. So it's continuing to press on, what is it about the people or the incidents that's leading you to believe that it's gang related?
Hi, I'm Virginia with the Statesman Journal in Salem, Oregon. I just wanted to get your general opinion on gang units in terms of police, and if you think those are important or necessary, and should there be, a group dedicated to that? What are the pros and cons of that? The reason I ask is because our Salem Police Department just recently disbanded their gang unit.
Oh, I knew about Portland. I didn't know about Salem.
Yeah,
okay.
And I would like to kind of look into the effects of that, but I just wanted to get your general opinion on that.
Yeah, this is a really tough issue because a lot of times, really what it boils down to is the amount of autonomy that's granted to the gang unit. And if they're correctly oriented, to being able to gather the right types of intelligence, they can, at least there's a good reason to believe that they could make a difference in stopping, say, retaliatory shootings. But again, there's going to be an opportunity cost. Can we do it for cheaper? Can we do it in a way that's less likely to come across as aggressive and suppression-oriented in communities? And so, for example, the Gang Reduction Youth Development in Los Angeles, they were able to cut retaliatory shootings down by, I think it was 35% by using violent interrupters as opposed to police to going after those violent incidents of violent retaliation. So, you do need to have people in a police department who specialize in that topic. Does it have to be a standalone gang unit? That's debatable. If they're properly oriented to, respecting civil rights, to gathering their intelligence, and using that to feed other members of the law enforcement or of the police department, well, then it's likely that that can be, a well-run gang unit. There's not a lot of research on the topic, to be honest with you. It's really hard to answer that question. We see a lot of bad behaviors on the part of gang units. What we don't see as much of is like empirical evidence that demonstrates their value. In Los Angeles, there was evidence that intelligence basically tanked after a gang unit was temporarily disbanded. And I can't recall if that was also associated with a rise of gang-related violence, partly because you don't really know if it's gang-related afterwards once those units disband, because the motivations for it, especially for non-homicides. For the homicides, usually detectives are able to discern a motive, but for the assaults, simple assaults, ag assaults, it's really difficult to determine if it's gang-related. So you want to have somebody in your community who is gathering that information, whether or not it's solely law enforcement or law enforcement in tandem with another group. I think that's really where we are right now in determining it.
Hi, my name is Akayla Lacey. I'm a reporter at The Intercept. This is really fascinating, so thank you for taking the time to do it. I wanted to ask if there's been some really good reporting in this last year on gangs within the LAPD, like among police officers. I was wondering if your research has touched on that phenomenon at all, and even if it hasn't, sort of like based on your expertise, like what you think the factors are that determine someone like a professional coming involved in a gang like that versus a young person who joins a gang.
Yeah, the RAND report that came out a couple of months ago on, within the LA Sheriff's Department about the cliques, as they refer to them as, it was illuminating. I was reading that thing and, highlighting just about every other sentence in it because I'm like, oh, that reads just like what the people I study tell me. This sounds like an interview that I just conducted with, say, an 18-year-old or with, a prisoner. And so there were some striking parallels between the RAND report, and there's been other reporting on this too, and what we're seeing within the LA Sheriff's Department. And so on the one hand, at times it's pretty easy for people to dismiss it and say, these are working professionals who are dealing with a difficult situation and they band together they drink and they play sports together, to deal with the stressors of the job. And I'm also thinking to myself, well, that sounds a lot like what the kids who are living in violent environments are also dealing with. So on the one hand, you sort of feel like, there should be some shared compassion on both sides because they're dealing with really difficult situations. On the other hand, there's a huge power differential. And one group has a lot of power and the other group has very little. So those are things to think about. But what people say is these exist in a lot of professions, but especially in professions like law enforcement or in corrections, where there is a lot of pressure on them and they're responding to these difficult situations and they're responding to violence that's gang-like. Malcolm Klein in Los Angeles, when he was studying, LAPD, LA Sheriff's Department, he put up this description of the gang and the gang unit and said, these two groups are very similar to one another in their behaviors. Now, how do you respond to something like that? It really comes down to, I think, organizational justice, procedural justice within the agency. You need to have abilities to report on these behaviors, the ability to sanction those types of behaviors because it shouldn't be tolerated within a law enforcement agency. You shouldn't have police groups fighting each other. You shouldn't have them carrying out, initiation rites or inviting people because they shot somebody on the street or they beat someone in a county jail. So it's a fascinating topic. I'm really interested in it, but it's hard to tell just how common it is. Like that survey from RAND, I think the response rate was, I don't know, 16% or something like that, 17%. So how representative of is that? It's not entirely clear to me.
Hi, I work with the Associated Press in Texas. My question is more regarding some of the comments that some of our Texas politicians have made in regards to immigration legislation that they have been working on, have been generalizing that people coming across the border, people being detained by CBP across the border are gang members or in gang-related violence. And I know a lot of the records that we have gotten from CBP and ICE can be either hard to attain or very selective in the data that they show. So what would you say would be the best practices to fact check some of the statements regarding immigration-related gang activity?
It's a great question. It's a really tough question to answer. Because so much of it is tied up with some of our traditional gang structures in the United States. You think of Central American gangs, but then also cartel-related activity. And I think that's one of the first questions that need to be answered. A lot of times transnational gang activity, these links are really elusive. Like they might exist on paper, but once you start to peel back the layers, there's really no connection, or the connection is a family member who's from two different areas. And so I wish I had a better answer to your question, but my recommendation would be to continue to pursue the whys and the hows. As it relates to the person, and then as it relates to how they got here and where they're going, because the immigration, it does exist. There's not a question that it doesn't, like, it does exist. It can happen, but it's the question of how representative is it. And you don't want to make legislation for these tiny rare incidents. You want to make legislation that deals with the bulk of the problem. And so I don't know a lot about this topic, to be honest with you, and I wish I knew more about it. Partly because it's so hard, like as difficult as it is to get into prisons to do research. I mean, that topic, you want to get into detention centers to do it. It's really difficult, and then to ask questions about gangs, it's even harder. So that's a long way of saying I don't have a good answer for you beyond just to be really curious and to continue to ask questions.
Hi there, Chuck Rabin, Miami Herald. I'm wondering how you define a gang, because there's a couple of older established gangs in the Miami area, but when you talk to the police, it's mostly small groups of young kids from 4 to 6 to 8 who are like switching groups because they're in love with some girl or because they have some beef going on Facebook or something. Mm-hmm. So what constitutes a gang as far as you're concerned?
Yeah, so let me just go back to here to have a good reference point for you. So this is very consistent with the legal definition right here. California's is pretty representative of the United States. And you're interested in the legal side. You're not interested in how researchers are talking about it, right? The numbers thing is kind of silly in my view. If you want to pick 3, 4, or 5, usually it's a group. So a group could be 3, 4, or 5. You can't have a group of 1. 2 is not really a group. It could be. It's just, so there's this structural typology that was introduced where you can have like that small, like a cell of say 6, 7 people. It would be considered more of like a specialty gang. And sometimes you'll see like tagger groups fit that definition because they specialize in a certain type of crime, robbery crews, stick-up crews, and so on. And they engage in that behavior consistently over time together. I mean, California doesn't come across and they have 3 or more people, formal or informal, so even formal groups that are recognized by government could be included in there. But they define it in terms of their primary activities as being some of their enumerated crimes. I think it's like 33 different things that they have. but to demonstrate a consistent pattern of that. And AB 333 actually said that those crimes had to be committed over the last 2 years, because before law enforcement would use like a 5-year period, a recall period for those criminal activities. So in terms of research though, I mean, this one isn't terribly helpful, but usually we're talking about a durable group over time. So something that's been in existence for say 3 to 6 months or more. We're talking about a group that has a public or a street orientation. It can't just be on the internet. You have to have a collective identity, something about names, signs, symbols that differentiates the in-group from the out-group. And then it has to have criminal activity that contributes to that group identity. This could be through rivals, this could be through specialized criminal activity like, say, graffiti, or this could be violence.
Hi. I've interviewed you before. I wanted to ask you, this is really weird because I was going to ask you about whether you had a sense of why there are gang flare-ups at certain times, like if it was connected to the crime rate or if it's connected to other things. And while we've been sitting here in the last 20 minutes, 5 teenagers were just shot outside of a high school in Aurora. And they're all being moved to the hospital, but they say the police have just said it was gang related, potentially. Obviously, you take that with an enormous grain of salt, but why would that flare up now? Like why are the timing, what's the timings of these things on why sometimes gang violence seems to be worse than others? Is it correlated with overall crime, or is it something else, since it's mostly young people?
It's a good question. That's a really good question. There's almost always underlying tensions that exist. Those tensions typically get worse when violence increases in our communities, because it leads people, young people, who don't feel safe to want to carry guns, and it leads them to want to protect themselves. And we know that when people carry guns, they're more likely to use those guns. So, the access to those weapons is one of the issues. But, major incidents of gang violence, we're talking about like long series of retaliatory incidents, can start over something as simple as stepping on someone's foot, a wayward stare, or talking to someone's girlfriend. Because all of a sudden what that does is it wraps up the group in what was originally an individual incident. So, when you bring up this in Aurora, let's suppose it is a gang-related assault. Suppose it is the first time these two groups have been in conflict with one another. I mean, you would really want to be able to have a system in place to be able to prevent the retaliatory action that's almost destined to come, because you're talking about two different groups who are in conflict with one another, and that conflict has then worsened as a result of that. Now, in terms of the timing, I mean, sometimes there is just no rhyme or reason. It can start over some of what we think of as the most trivial things, but in the lives of those young people, it's not a trivial thing, that step on the foot, that dirty look, or disrespecting someone's girlfriend. But it's just to say that there's like a temporal order associated with it, where gang-related incidents beget more gang-related incidents in communities. And those things do tend to be exacerbated when there's higher violence in communities in the first place. So it's just to say that there are fits and starts to it. Things can quiet down. It could be something as simple as a gang leader getting out of prison and their status is not recognized when they get out, because there has been like a succession of leadership. And so that gang leader gets out and provokes conflict with another group to bring greater cohesion within their group, where then their status is re-recognized by the gang. I mean, there's been incidents of that have been documented. So there's a number of different things that could explain it. But in terms of the ebb and the flow, that's something different. That's something that's more difficult to be able to explain. It's just you got to have somebody out there who's trying to intervene.